Locust is a suite of 9 poems that draws on scientific study of grasshoppers transforming into locusts and their potential to revert, alongside the phenomenon of fascism reoccurring in cycles in human societies. Thus reads the first paragraph of the introduction to Locust by Joel O'Connor. He goes on to say that, as with science, his poetry doesn't purport to know all the answers, and, in fact, is often an exercise in exploring why, to stimulate curiosity and debate in the reader. Joel is a multidimensional artist, writing, producing music, theater, poetry, and graphic art, with a streak of arts activism. He has recently helped to raise funds for the schooling of the siblings of a shooting victim, Melody Chiputura, in Zimbabwe, run a campaign to restore the art studio of Albert Namitijira in 2012, was a coordinator for the musical acts at the 2006 Festival for Peace in Sydney, among other initiatives. He has written articles published in Spine magazine and the South Sydney Herald, is the author of the books of poetry Locust, Hope Pokes Its Head Over the Lip of Your Soul, and more, a translator from Russian to English of Mikhail Prishvin, a musician, producer, and lead singer of Andorra, and has written and produced multiple plays. Joel, it's Tuesday for you, it's Monday for me. We've already had our time zone difference debacle. Thank you for being here and taking some time to chat with me. I really appreciate
It's a
it.
pleasure, Zach, and thank you to Daylight Savings for catching us on the hop.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah, when you plan a couple months ahead across many time zones, that is something to factor in. and
It's
and
true.
now I know. So I wanted to start with this transformation from grasshopper into locust and sometimes back again. When did you first learn about that?
Yeah, well, a lot of my poetry is based around science and what I get out of science, which is wonder and possibility, and also putting us in our place as a species, I suppose, in where we center ourselves in the world and how we relate to the earth and nature. So I was reading some research a few years ago about locusts and the fact that grasshoppers are a very benign insect. They're almost like hermits. They live out in the desert by themselves. They have a very drab appearance, almost like they're wearing, sackcloth and ashes, and they live this solitary life. But if they come together within a couple of hours, they put on armor and they beef up and they get racing stripes and they develop toxin in them so they can't be eaten and they go on a rampage. And so I was fascinated by that, but also the questions that arise, which is, well, would it ever be possible if they dispersed for them ever to revert back to their grasshopper state? Is it a permanent thing? Do the offspring that they create end up as locusts? How's it work? So with all of these kind of questions, I'm interested and fascinated to go and talk to scientists. So I started asking scientists who work with locusts about this. And a lot of what came back is, well, we don't really know. There have been some lab experiments and stuff where they have gone back to being grasshoppers, so it is possible. But there really hasn't been that much done. It's more about, the scientific approach of containment that we often see in the natural world, which is let's deal with the problem, let's strafe them with poison, let's consider the existence of a locust a problem rather than actually trying to learn about the behavioural nature of the animal and what could be done to try and prevent our conflicts with each other. And so as I was studying this, it was sort of coming up then that this relationship that they have and the way that they change sort of mirrors what we go through in our world as well. And the cycle that we're in at the moment, which is far right extremism becoming more prevalent around the world, endangering democracies. From a perspective here in the Antipodes, us looking on America with a level of distress and despair at what's happening to democracy, but seeing these fascist overtones in politics, I drew the connection there between the way that grasshoppers come together seemingly for tenderness and a gathering, which in its first instance is pragmatic. They're trying to get out of the heat or whatever. But as soon as they come into contact with each other, they change, and their whole modus operandi goes from being benign to being aggressive. So in looking into that and being interested in, political theory and so on, I wrote a suite of poems that looked at both that scientific change of grasshopper to locust and then also cycles of fascism, with the open-ended question of what happens afterwards. What happens when the plague is over, when the cycle of madness is over? Can we go back to what we were? Can we go back to a more benign society? Or are we stuck with that? So that was the foundation of the poems, to look at us and also look at the natural world and, what the lessons are for us about that, while also being fascinated by the wonder of this incredible creature that goes through this cycle of change, which is unique in the world.
Yeah, it all comes through in the suite of poems. It's such a powerful metaphor, and I've got a few thoughts in response to what you just said. First of all, you pointed out that in your research and in engaging with some of the scientists who have spent a lot of time on this, they said that there hasn't been a lot of research about the potential to revert. It's clearly possible, but because the response has been generally, they're bad, let's poison them, let's just deal with the problem, let's not ask curious questions, right? There hasn't been enough research to say what needs to happen for that to happen. And isn't that just sort of a fascistic impulse right there? And so it adds this other layer for me, having read the poem and thinking about, as you said, sort of everything going on. And I, rest assured, there are a few people over here in the States who are looking on at least as distressed, with at least as much distress as you all, at everything that's going on right now. And
yeah, we feel you. We know. Yeah.
Yeah, and it feels a little bit like maybe a you reap what you sow kind of situation. But then the question of your poem becomes so important. I mean, a couple of the questions of your poem become so important. One, how do we treat each other tenderly during this time? And two, how do we come back to, a state of calm and a state of, whether it's benign or just more communal, pro-community, I'll say, pro-social, rather than, it's my way or the highway, dog eat dog kind of mentality.
Yeah, well, we see it. And in the poem, I use some, language of other societies that have gone through this experience in, lesser or more extreme degrees, to look at how we do that, how we have that reconciliation. So there's a term in the poem I use, a Rwandan term called ubuzaze, which came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the genocide in Rwanda, and it means a collective madness. And I was fascinated by that idea because the people talking about it in the wake of what happened and looking through their society in the ruins of that and trying to rebuild, describe this term of people being caught up in this collective madness that seemed to take away reason and rationale, and it swept over the country like a mist or a fog, and drew everybody in. And that, not going into the complexities of what was happening in that society, is not dissimilar to a political mood catching fire and affecting people. And, it is what often happens when things like fascism rise, and it becomes a groupthink that passes from one person to another and gains power that way, which, coming back to the metaphor of the locusts, is very similar, that the locusts out of expediency come together to be protected from an outside threat, an environmental threat. And then when they come into close proximity with each other, they touch each other. And this passes pheromones or, feelings between the locusts. And that's the catalyst of the change. So from our perspective as humans, people who take advantage of times in society where there is distress, when post-COVID happens, when, in the US, you've had the financial crisis and, decades of loss of power and opportunity for people. Somebody coming in and saying, you are powerless, but just give me the rest of your power. Give me all the tools and the mechanisms for decision making, and I will get rid of the other. The problem is not you, but we'll make a Faustian pact where I will punish another group, a different group to you, and by that I will benefit you by you having access to more resources, and this will change things. All you need to do is just give up your decision making and give it to me, and then everything will be okay, which is exploiting people's vulnerability in that situation, and offering them something tender, which is, a father figure, a sense of you as a group having a sense of belonging, you having an identity together, and me being the catalyst for, the war machine or whatever it is that's needed to take on the rest. So those parallels between the insects and humans are very strong in that way, which is, what's fascinated me in writing these suite of poems. And, at the end of it, to kind of look at the overlay of where this all started for us, the industrialization cycle that we're in over the last 500 years, what, in Latin America is sometimes talked about as La Noche de los 500 años, the night of the 500 years, and how industrialization has, displaced the world that existed prior, and we're in this locust cycle ourselves, and our plague of industrialization and environmental harm has been going on for 500 years. So when does it stop in that respect, and then what happens to us once that's over?
Yeah, so much brilliant stuff to chew on in all that. The wording that you use in the poem is to focus on sort of the tenderness again, and I love the way that you just phrased it, the sort of father figure, right? Somebody's in crisis, they're looking for help, and somebody comes in and takes advantage of that and manipulates that situation for their own gain by playing the role of a trusted figure, a father figure, an older sibling, something like that. I had this experience, I guess it was a few months ago now, when Trump and Netanyahu were on their pedestal talking about the Nobel Peace Prize, where I was watching the news and it just was like this surreal experience where it was like they were both babies, like a New Yorker cartoon, like some sort of political cartoon where they were both just babies, and they just both seemed so scared to me, even though they are both people who, in this situation that you're describing, are assuming that role of manipulative father figure or manipulative leader and taking advantage of so many people, and then also hurting so many, just flat out hurting so many people. To see that sort of multiple perspective and to be able to understand and treat the world with tenderness and kindness, it seems like it might be important if we want to go in a direction where we get back to tenderness and kindness and a sort of more community oriented aspect in the long run. To treat the world that way in our poetry and just person to person seems really important.
Yeah, I agree, and I think what you're describing is, the contradiction in fascism of fear, that the confluence of power into a single person, the feeling that there's always something to lose, even in the extremely wealthy, shows an inability to have confidence in the distribution of power and decision making amongst the group. In a political context in which I work, I often talk to people about the distribution of power, and if you are a man in the West, who's white, and who enjoys the pathway of power and opportunity your whole life because the structures of society have been built to advantage you. If you give up some of that power and redistribute it to other groups, and you presently hold 95% of the power, and you were to distribute that 5% of that to other people, and you still had 90% of the power, have you lost anything? Are you still in a position of absolute privilege? What is the fear in you of being able to let go of anything and thinking that this will open the floodgates and you will no longer be in a position of opportunity? That reasoning that you see in Netanyahu and Trump is that fear dominating people of that persuasion and advantage, who think that giving up anything means giving up everything, rather than accepting their incredible privilege and using that to uplift others rather than actually taking that power away.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that poets and artists of all variety have a responsibility to engage with current events, to see things like the locust and the / grasshopper and learn about it and draw that metaphor out to show the rest of the world?
Well, I think rather than a responsibility, I think what I love about poetry is that it's the emotional news at the time. That when I go and see readings, I see what poets are thinking about. They're not necessarily talking the news, the who, what, where, when, why that you might see in the newspaper or on the television, but they're telling you about how the emotions of people at a particular time are processing the world. And for me, that's often more important than the news of the day, which the decisions are often out of people's hands. So it's certainly essential that artists and poets continue to challenge authority and talk about the emotional experience and the insight of people in response to that. And we listen to them and we share their voice. And in recent experience, poets like Renee Good, become victims. So they are sharing their insight. They are expressing their emotional passion about seeing the change in the rights and freedoms, and speaking out. They become victims. But her work and the work of poets is what people like myself want to share with others and encourage, so that people reflect on that and their emotional connection with each other, which is how we hold the line and how we change.
Yeah, I think it was Ezra Pound who had his own questionable interactions with fascism, who said poetry is news that stays news.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
When did you learn about the idea, or how were you introduced to the idea of serial poetry? And how did you know that this suite of poems needed to be a serial poem?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm interested that the poetry organisation that you are connected to draws on Federico Garcia Lorca and this concept of duende, which I love, which
Mm-hmm.
is this imp or this energy that drives artistic inspiration. When I came across that in looking, into this interview, it reminded me of a similar thing that a German writer, Walter Moers, came up with some years ago that I identify with called the Orm, which is the creative drive that you have that tells you where you're going to take something or what form something's going to take, as opposed to you having to say, okay, now I'm going to sit down and write a poem. It's like, well, this is my experience today. The leaves are changing. I feel like turning this into a song, or I'm going to paint a painting, or so the artistic drive is always there, and it forms what you do with it in that moment, and you're open to that sort of inspiration. So with suites of poems like this, it's the same thing. It could be a 5-line poem, or with some of the longer works I have, like some of the poems in Hope Pokes Its Head Over the Lip of Your Soul, or this, I feel that there's a whole lot of things that need to be said and interconnected. And, each of the poems within the book stand on their own, but they're also, it's a little vignettes, I suppose, that connect into a bigger thing as well. So with this, I realized it was going to be bigger than, 50 lines, because there was so much in there in terms of our politics, our humanity, what cycle we're in, and this overall concept of we're sort of in a locust plague cycle ourselves, which is industrialization that's been going on for 500 years, and we've been sweeping the world in a plague in that way. It's consuming resources in the same way that we see, locust plagues consuming resources in a smaller degree. So when I was a kid, I had a book that my grandfather had got as a engagement present from my grandma, called The Torchbearers, by a Irish or English poet called Alfred Noyes. And it was all about Galileo and the discovery of astronomy and this sort of stuff. But it was all in verse, and it was so beautifully written that it was science and history and rhyme in a really easy to understand and absorb way, but all of those things together. So have always been touched by that kind of work, and that's sort of led some of the more complex work that I do, which is similar. That it's a novel, as well as being individual poems that are all connected to a scientific or political theme, but it always comes down to the human experience and human emotion.
Yeah, it seems to me that impulse that you find is also related to why you're an artist of many mediums, why you like music and theater and poetry and visual art and do all those things.
Yeah, and I love that. I remember reading once that Beck Hansen, the musician, would be in the studio and he'd be like, you know what, now let's stop singing. I've got to go and bake a cake. And like, I get it. You're being guided by the thing you want to do in the moment. All power to you. I get it. That's what you need to do in that moment. Your creativity right then is making a cake.
Sometimes it's making a cake. That's
That's
great.
right.
So speaking of multiple mediums, you made a film with you reading over the Locust poems over the video. How did that come about? Tell me a little about that.
Yeah, so I look to try and illustrate some of my poetry in video form to make it easier for people to take in, whether they're just listening to the audio or seeing the video. So did a lot of research into I guess locusts in Australia, up in the northeastern plains of Australia. There is a particular type of locust called the Australian bush locust that lives in a very isolated desert area. and it will occasionally come out and have plagues, but otherwise it lives there in its solitary life, and that's a beautiful part of the world. I love the desert. I love the openness and the silence of places like that. So when I started writing this poem, I started it from a point of those creatures in that environment in their natural state, and trying to bring out my experience and love of that particular landscape in its brutality and beauty at the same time, and then looking for imagery and video imagery that supported that. Managed to come across a lot of documentaries that scientific bodies and so on had done about locusts, and pieced it together into a video that showed them in line with the movements of the poem itself, to give people something to watch, and also put the text on the screen to make it easy to understand, because something like this poem is complex in ways, and I want to find the best way for everybody to be able to take it in, whether it's listening to the audio, seeing the video, or reading the text, whatever their intelligence is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like the the effort to interface with the audience in many ways, and it's interesting. I would wonder how people, what your experience has been, if any, of how people are coming back to you after experiencing the poem in different ways. Have you had people talk to you about the video versus just the on the page, or hearing you read it somewhere at a reading or anything like that?
Yeah, I think more the emotional response, I think, as opposed to the medium that it's in. People just responding to, the sweeping possibility in the poem, and the extraordinary, information and images that come out of it, which most people don't know about, in terms of even knowing that a grasshopper is a locust, or knowing anything about that change. And then, the poem providing them with connection between what we're going through as a world, and our emotional experience of that as well, which sort of encompasses what I want, which is to open that possibility and that wonder to people, and that surprise, to leave that thought within them about what do they do to connect with others when they come across these trials and obstacles, or these tensions, as I do when I talk to friends who tell me that, well, maybe they're thinking of moving and supporting groups that are more far right, because they're populist. In Australia, there's a lot of build off Trump. The wealthiest woman in Australia, who is a mining magnate worth $100 billion, is bankrolling a Trump light political party, which is anti-immigration at the moment, and buying the head of this party her own $2 million private jet to fly around the country, and really trying to push this anti-immigration agenda off the back of Trump. And they've been hanging out in Mar-a-Lago with Trump. They are now Trump acolytes here. So in my personal experience, when I see people who are touched by that pheromone of political idea, and who are thinking of perhaps changing or being drawn into that, well, it's my responsibility in my own sense to just ask them to questions, not to tell them this or that, or there's a right or wrong, but just to have a think about what do we gain by that, who is losing out of that, and where else have we seen that, and what have been the benefits and the consequences, to try and get them thinking and to steer away from potentially getting drawn into that, because we're all threatened by it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What harms one of us, harms all of us.
Mm.
And you say in the introduction almost exactly that, that it's rewarding for you when you get to engage with thinkers about their ideas or research and to find the intersections between poetry and science that helps you form your take on discoveries and the questions that come out of it. So just that
Mm.
curiosity mindset is very clear all the way through, about, how do you ask a good question? What's if you're going to do something, why?
Yeah.
What's the impulse moving that? And I think that, there's a really strong element of surprise mind in your poem, and in your poetry, uh, that comes from a lot of things, but that helps to build that sense of curiosity and that sense of invitation. Like, for example, you use different kinds of tones, different diction throughout the poem. One example was in section 6 that really, really hit me. Human type A of the anterior cingulate cortex, that middling slice of cucumber. So you hit the reader with this, like, sort of very heady, neuroscientific, language, right? The anterior cingulate cortex, and then you call it that middling slice of cucumber, right? Like, what is that? And
Well,
that
that brain's a
starts,
hamburger, isn't it? It's thrown together
yeah,
over time in some random way that evolution has piled on top of each other, and right in there at the very core, is something that distinguishes us very much in the science of the right and the left wing brain, if you want to talk about it very simply, and how those whose brains are stimulated by particular parts of it, who are scientists shown are more right wing, have a greater fear element, and that bedrock of what we've talked about in terms of the fascism, which is the fear of the other, and the fear of rigidity and rules and so on, as opposed to other humans, so human type A, human type B, which is more the emotional driven community connection type. So, looking at the absurdity of that and thinking of the brain as a hamburger that's sort of thrown together over time, we've got this little pickle right in the middle that's sandwiched between stuff that has so much of an effect on whether we focus more on community and connection and empathy, or whether we focus more on fear and rules and exclusion.
yeah, absolutely. My day job right now is as a Spanish teacher, so I loved seeing the Spanish in in the poem. Um, and one of the things that draws me to that is that learning another language can help you develop more empathy. And so I really love that you included several languages, some just a word, and some a little bit more throughout the poem. Um, do you think that using those different languages, drawing those bridges sort of between, for example, I think you referenced, the Guarani from in Paraguay, right?
Mm.
And drawing that connection to the situation that happened in Rwanda, and with what's happening right now in the United States. Um, why use those other languages too? How does that help build those connections? How does it move you closer to that energy and that goal of empathy and connection?
Yeah, well, I think our appreciation of language and culture uh, means that we understand that sometimes there is a concept or a way of describing something in one language that doesn't have a direct translation into another language, but is powerful in terms of our humanity and our understanding. So, I've had the opportunity to live in Paraguay for a number of years, and Paraguay, in terms of our Night of the 500 Years, is the epicenter. It's where the Jesuit missionaries landed 500 years ago. These benign grasshoppers in their sackcloth turning up in South America amongst the Guarani and the Tupi in Brazil, the connected nations of people there, selling a principle of tenderness, that they had this benign God who, offered, a path to salvation. And whether they were conscious or unconscious, they were the vanguard for a plague which came behind them. The Cortezes and the military industrial complex of Europe that followed those Jesuits, who set up the guardrails or the structures to enable the destruction of those civilizations there. Well, to me, at the end of this poem, that's the last movement, which is coming back to what happened there in 500 years ago, and drawing that connection between that time and the ongoing plague of environmental destruction and capitalism that we're continuing to go through, that's continuing to consume the world without stop. So it's very important for me to use Guarani concepts and language in the questions that are put at the end of the poem about, well, you said that your God was like this. Why have you got swords now? Why are you killing my people? When you told me that you were benign, you seem to have changed. I don't really understand where it's going. So being able to use the language itself to describe that improves the emotional impact, and also encourages the reader to explore that as well, and understand the existence of the other, which is part of the poem as well, which is there is no other. If you're being told that you align yourselves with the political principle of benefiting at the exclusion of the other, or perhaps a poem like this is trying to encourage you to stimulate that other part of your brain and your empathy to question whether you're being drawn into a ruse, and whether that's actually something that's a benefit to us or not. Because we're all connected to this, and our language, demonstrates this as well.
Yeah, we've all got our feet on the ground, unless maybe you're in a private jet most of your day. Yeah.
Complaining about the fuel crisis, by the way. Flying around the country complaining about the fuel crisis in a
right.
private jet your Trump acolyte has bought you. Yeah.
Yeah. The irony's not lost on me. And I also think that the discussion and the bringing in of Latin America, like you referenced 500 years ago, but also the more recent past, that the history there is unfortunately rife with intense right-wing movements that many of which were influenced or directly caused by United States interference, and so the incorporation of that area of the world carries with it all that history, and really, just it lands an impactful blow when you're taking it all in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the concept of the Night of the 500 Years is that we're still in the shadow of that. The plague cloud is still above us, blocking out the sun, and we've been going through this, as a people in the Americas for this long. So when does the sky break? We're still in this plague cycle, because nothing's changed, and what we've seen in recent times in terms of the Middle East and the Americas, in continuing to push the petrochemical wars and take the easiest option, which is to push the democracy and the lives of people aside for for wealth, exploitation, for oil, and so on, shows us that we're still in the middle of our plague.
Yeah, yeah. Um, at the very end of the poem, you reference Tupinambo and Tominu. Who are they?
So in Brazil and Paraguay, they have related languages and cultural backgrounds. So the Guarani and the Tupi, are the two peoples of those countries as they are now, and those regions, as you describe the bioregional relationship between the people that lived in that part of the world as opposed to the national boundaries that are there now. So they were the origin children of the foundation of those cultures and those societies, in contrast to the Western Christian idea of creation. So they were the foundations of the language and the cultures and the peoples of that part of the world.
Yeah, it's the movement of through the poem, and the way it engages with religion is so interesting, and ending on that note, I think, is so potent, because closer to the beginning of the poem, you have this reference to sort of more Jesuit practice, the ash, the sackcloth, that kind of thing. And then towards the end, you have the Guarani, you have the reference to these two sort of original children of those indigenous cultures. And I think that is so potent, and takes us a step closer towards the communal, the sharing. It seems so simple when you just say, well, if we would just share, right, like it's kindergarten or something, but to a certain extent, that's sort of the offer you're making.
Well, that's right. And coming back to what we were saying before about, do you lose anything by sharing? Just reflect on yourself and who you are as the reader. Where are you in the world? How does your opportunity, your privilege, your ability to, influence your society and politics and the people around you contrast with the rest of the world? And if you were more sharing of your time and wealth and resources, would you actually be losing anything? Because there are political forces that are telling you that you would, and that instead of sharing, you should reinforce their power and their wealth, and they will then protect you once you do not have, that political power and influence anymore. So I don't find that. Yeah, I don't find that sharing costs me anything, my motivation, in some degree, is to pass the pheromone of an alternative to the locust on to people, which is a concept of sharing and connection to your country, your lands, your people, and looking at the wisdom of First Nations and Indigenous cultures and what they teach us about connection to country, and how that can then inspire you to be more respectful of the land, the resources, and the people around you, to try and shift that balance.
Fantastic. Would you like to read that first section of the poem?
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be brilliant, and I think we'll end on that.
I call it the pathogen of positivity. I put that in an article I wrote about another poetry project I was involved in recently that is about passing on that power and those abilities to other people to shift that balance. So it is a contagion in a way, but it's a positive one. So this is the first section of Locust. Pox of mitchell grass, tasselled scalps embedded in the ground, space out in formation across a broken land, to shelter living things come in from the wild. There is respite, not indulgence, behind their frugal woody doors. Still, circular sanctuaries they are, fanning out in open-palmed, meditative pose. Under their cool eaves, the pilgrims, Aurolian clasped together, have a chance for quiet pause as they look out on parrots strolling the ruptured clay with Churchillian ponderance, the sabre-nosed rats, mouths full of sore teeth, murdering the termites, and the fissures in the soil cracked, red or black, weaving with the same languid curves as the burnt-skinned snakes, using them as highways to shimmy along. A wanderer may find a place among the twiggy blades as they are lured out from their hermitages by a call to mass. Golden threshy spires rising above the sparse plant life draw them, beacons shining within the ravages of droughts and under the boom of breaking rains and the false abundance that follows. To a sermon so uneventful at first, one then another is ushered into the foliage, arranging themselves with respectful distance. In quiet unity, worshippers still maintain their moana, not making a sound or ending their fast, or taking up a spot along pews of straw, wavering in the heat. Unlike us, there are no kings among them, demanding tax for protection as a way to thin out the congregation. There is none to set a cap on who can enter heaven. They arrive and keep arriving, straining the proxemics as they shuffle to stay apart and preserve the vows of the recluse within a crowd, all sworn to the same oath. It has to happen eventually, a gentle brush of a leg against another, even just the hair on their skin, ever so lightly connecting, the smallest of acts, like the tip of a little finger on your earlobe. In them, the same avalanche comes crashing, the shock of realizing their tactile starvation. As we do, they relive the oldest stories written, the knowledge awakening of Eden. More than the taste of food withheld, now swelling realization. Contact brings a burst of elation and the choice to remain a loner, keeping the mania dormant, or joining the hive mind of feeling, unleashing the demon. But oh, to be touched and risk gorging after famine and exposure to a refeeding syndrome of emotion as brains swim in their heady serum of serotonin. Temptation upends monkish ways entirely. Giving in, the hypnotic drone from the countless rubbing legs mirrors the rhythmic nodding of overpowering sleep, brought on by a desert haze blurring the vision. But to the creator, it has the opposite effect. It is physical communion. It is activation.
Fabulous. Thank you for reading, Joel, for taking the time to talk with me. I am so grateful that we were able to overcome the challenges of daylight savings and have this conversation today, because this was really, I had chills a couple of times while you were talking. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Zachary. And if anybody wants to get in contact with me, they can look up my website, joeloconnor.net, or email me at joel@joeloconnor.net, and I can tell them more about the book.
Excellent. And is there anything else that you wanted to talk about right now? We will post links when we post this to your website and to the video as well. And was there anything else going on recently that you want to share?
Oh, I just want to say that we love you. We know what's happening in America, and we have you in our minds, and we know that there are people like you, Zach, who are out there doing what we can, which is to share conversation and ideas. We're in a battle of ideas, and we're in a battle of decision making in people's minds about what they choose to do, while the apparatus of democracy is still available to them to change. So, we believe in you, we feel you, and it hurts us, but we are using our hive mind to send our goodwill and our power to you as you struggle through this.
Well, I and we are very grateful. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.